Throughout the year, we will be studying cultures of the world and learning about different groups of people, such as the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese, Aztec, and others. We're going to learn how they lived and the contributions they've shared throughout history to our present culture. But how do we know about these cultures that have come before us? There's different groups of scientists, and we're going to talk about each one of those. And you could call them people watchers of past and present cultures. So as you can see, we have archaeologists, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientist, and historian. So as I'm talking about these different social scientists, you're going to be typing in your notes what we're discussing about these. So the first one, an archaeologist. They study things made and used by ancient cultures. So objects made and used by ancient people, which are, as we already learned, artifacts. So they're the ones digging in the dirt, looking around, seeing what they can find that has been made by people, and learning about cultures from that. So again, archaeologists study the things made and used by ancient cultures. The next one is a sociologist. You can think of sociologists like social people. They study how different people within a culture get along with one another. So how has one culture interacted and done things with a different culture? Did they get along? Did they fight? Were there wars? Did they collaborate? What did they do? So again, the sociologist studies how different people in a culture get along with one another. So you have the archaeologist looking at how people made things, and the sociologist looking to see how cultures got along with each other. Then we have the anthropologist. They're the ones who study the customs of a group of people. So the way people did things. How did they live their life? What rituals, religions did they have? That's the anthropologist. They study the customs of a group of people. Then we have the political scientists. With the political, you can look at this word and think politics, government. Political scientists are the ones who look at the laws and the government of a culture. How did they run their laws? How did they run their government? How were decisions made? Who was in charge? The political scientist is the one looking at the laws and the government of a culture. And then finally, the last social scientist we have is historian. They're the ones who are looking at, the oral history, the stories that have been told, the written records of different cultures. They're the ones looking at what history has been preserved by these cultures and what can we learn about these cultures from that. So again, historian, study the written records of different cultures. So these are the different ways we can find out information about different cultures. We can look at, the artifacts they left behind, like the archaeologist. We can look at how, they interacted with other, societies. We can look at what customs, the way of life, what it was for each individual culture. What was their government like? And then what did they write down for their history? All these play a part in helping us figure out what a culture was like. But not every culture has been studied on Earth. As we're sitting here, there's actually some cultures in our world that have never been contacted. Scientists estimate there are at least 100 uncontacted cultures worldwide. Of this number, most of them live in the Amazon rainforest in Peru or Brazil. There was actually an airplane that recently flew over a remote area of Brazil, and it took a photograph of one of these uncontacted tribes. The people, their bodies were dyed bright red and black, stood outside of a thatched hut, which is a hut made of grass. They pointed their bows up toward the airplane as it passed overhead. And I want you guys to think, if you found a tribe like this, would you make contact with the people? Do you think scientists should leave uncontacted cultures alone? If we find uncontacted cultures, should we just leave them be, or should we make contact? The next thing on your note sheet is there's a box here that asks that question. Do you think scientists should leave uncontacted cultures alone? Should they leave them be, or should they make contact? What do you think? And why do you think that? So I want you to say if we should contact them or not contact them, and why you think that. So some of these words we've talked about what tells us a history of a place. One of the things is the culture. We can look at the culture of a place. You know, we live in an amazing world. You know, and as we learn about different cultures throughout this year, you know, we're going to learn some pretty neat things. But what is a culture? You know, what is a custom? You know, there's some other words. Have you experienced culture contact? Have you been affected by global interdependence? You know, we're going to take a look now at some of these words, kind of see how they affect our life and how they've affected the past as well. So the first thing is culture. A culture is a group of people with the same ways of doing things. You know, no matter how modern or simple a culture may seem, you know, there's things that all cultures have in common. You know, all cultures typically have some kind of religious belief. You know, most cultures have a need for laws, you know, governing what's right and wrong and what to do if you break those laws. You know, a type of communication or language, a way to talk with each other. All cultures also, you know, have a certain way of seeing beauty or, you know, art. You know, and we're not born knowing the rules and ways of our culture. We had to learn it from members of our culture. You know, when you were born, did you know that you should cover your mouth when you sneeze? You know, I think about a little 3-year-old and how they sneeze. They kind of sneeze everywhere. But in our culture, it's just common courtesy to cover your sneeze, and they have to be taught that. You know, also we're not born knowing, you know, to chew with your mouth closed. People don't want to see you chewing your food, but again, I think of the 3-year-old. They just chomp with their mouth open, and they have to be taught that. You know, your parents, teachers, church, or community all help to teach you to be part of a culture. So our culture, again, is a group of people with the same way of doing things. We are not just born knowing our culture, it is something that we are taught. Our culture is taught to us how to do things. Each group of people also have customs. So a custom is the accepted way of doing things among a group of people. Can you think of any customs for other cultures? Perhaps, you know, you could think of how Chinese and Japanese bow to greet each other instead of shaking hands. Also, in some other cultures, you know, it's important to know their customs because you may accidentally upset someone without knowing, and it's important for them to know our culture as well so that they can know, you know, that we're not intentionally upsetting them or intentionally doing things to be rude. For example, you know, in Indonesia, you never point the bottoms of your feet at anyone. The soles of your feet or shoes are considered very dirty, so it is rude to do this. Another example of a custom that we might not even think or realize, or that is different from our way of life, is in Japan, slurping your noodles very loudly is a sign that you like the meal, which is completely different. You know, in our culture, that custom is not accepted, but that is the standard in Japan. Being a quiet noodle eater just won't do. But don't eat all the food on your plate in China, as this is considered rude. You know, here we're always told, you know, clear your plate, eat all your food, but in China, that is not expected. That is not what you should do. So each group of people have a different way of doing things. A custom is the accepted way of doing things. You know, cultures can and do change. And usually change comes when one culture meets another culture. When these two cultures meet and exchange ideas, that's culture contact. So that's when two cultures are coming in contact with each other and exchanging the ideas. You know, one example is when, you know, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans met each other. Those two cultures came into contact. And then the Native Americans taught the Pilgrims, you know, how to use dead fish as fertilizer for corn, or how to grow, squash, beans, and corn together for better yield of food. So that's an example of how two cultures have come into contact and they exchanged ideas. Europeans learned about paper making, eyeglasses, the yo-yo, kites, and umbrellas from the Chinese. And Germans gave the world the Christmas tree. Skiing comes from Norway. There's lots of different things that have been shared around the world. One thing, so again, culture contact is when those two cultures meet and exchange ideas. One thing you have to be careful about, though, is, thinking that yours is the best and having kind of a poor attitude about it. That's called ethnocentric. So when you start judging someone else, because of their culture, according to your own values, that's ethnocentric. Do you need to agree with what they do? No, you do not need to. But when you start acting poorly towards the person because they do different things differently than you, that's when it gets to be ethnocentric. Just kind of some of the funny things around the world eating wise, sometimes in China, they'll eat jellyfish, but that's not something we would ever think of eating. But that's just not the norm for our culture. That's not a custom for us. But whereas, foods we eat, other cultures will look at that and go, whoa, that's a strange food to eat. So just knowing that everyone has a different way of doing things, and that's okay. Now, because we are so connected, our world has what's called global interdependence. You could think of our world as a pond. If you throw a pebble into a pond, it causes ripples, and eventually the ripples reach the edge of the pond. Same thing for us. Whatever happens in one part of the world is going to affect other parts of the world. You could think of, Brazil, the rainforest. There's a rippling effect to the United States. As trees are cut down, rainforests will produce less oxygen, there will be more pollution, plus losing animals and plants native to the area will be a loss for the world. Global interdependence also shows, how different parts of the world depend on one another, with goods and services moving between countries. Just think about the clothes we wear. Think about where they come from. Think about just different things that we buy from other countries, different things that other countries buy from us. We are all connected. We've kind of thinking about what all we buy. If something happens in a different country, that affects, how we can get stuff. Thinking about if something happens to one of our products here in the U.S., we're not able to sell as much to other countries. Everything we do affects other parts of the world. So again, global interdependence, different parts of the world depend on one another. Now we're going to talk about one anthropologist, and her name is Margaret Mead. She was born in 1901 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her family moved around a lot because her parents were professors, which means her parents taught at a college or university. She envied other kids who had lived in one place. She was jealous of that. She really wished she didn't move around as much. As an adult, Mead would become one of the most famous anthropologists, studying other cultures and their customs. She wanted to learn whether different cultures, even what we consider primitive ones, ones who aren't as advanced, if they had things in common. What better way to learn about other cultures, than to live with them rather than just read about them. So Mead went and lived among people in different parts of the world. She spent her life living with and studying cultures in areas like New Guinea, Samoa, and Bali. She learned the language of the people and followed the customs of the different cultures. She didn't want to just be an observer, but a participant in the cultures, meaning she wanted to actually experience what people did in these cultures. She wrote 44 books and more than 1,000 articles. While she was living with people in Bali, she took more than 30,000 photographs. She was one of the first to use photography as an anthropology tool. She once said, "I have spent most of my life studying the lives of other peoples, faraway peoples, so that Americans might better understand themselves." Her work made a lot of people interested in other cultures and actually, changed some incorrect beliefs about cultures. Her studies showed that all cultures have a lot of things in common. So, for example, she said, "One of the oldest human needs is having someone to wonder where you are when you don't come home at night." And so for the last thing I want you to do on this note sheet is I want you to think about, what did Margaret Mead mean by one of the oldest human needs is having someone to wonder where you are when you don't come home at night? So why is that important to people? Why would people need that in their culture? So you're going to fill that in, and once you get your notes filled out, be sure to click close on the note sheet and then click turn it in. Again, if you have any questions about submitting the work or how to access the work, or just any questions about any of the information, message me in Teams, send me an email, message me on Remind, and I will get back to you.